The stagecoach rattled to a halt in front of the Williams, Arizona post office, kicking up dust that swirled in the late afternoon sunlight. Samuel Cunningham shifted his weight from one boot to the other, nervously adjusting his collar as he waited. The letter in his pocket had been read so many times the creases were beginning to tear. 6 weeks of correspondence had led to this moment, the arrival of his mail-order bride from St. Louis. Samuel had spent every spare penny on making the small ranch house presentable, even splurging on a proper bed frame rather than the simple cot he'd been using since establishing his cattle operation 2 years prior. It was 1887, and like many men who had ventured west to claim their fortune, Samuel had found the work plentiful but female companionship scarce. At 32, he was considered a confirmed bachelor by most in Williams, but the loneliness of the Arizona Territory had finally driven him to place an advertisement in an Eastern newspaper. The response from Miss Grace O'Malley had seemed heaven-sent. Her letters were thoughtful, her handwriting elegant, and her understanding of hardship appealing to a man who had built everything from nothing. The driver hopped down from his perch, moving around to open the stagecoach door. Samuel straightened his vest and brushed dust from his best shirt, the same one he wore to church on Sundays. His heart hammered against his ribs as the first passenger disembarked, an elderly man who tipped his hat to Samuel before shuffling toward the hotel. Then she appeared, one gloved hand gripping the frame of the door as she carefully stepped down. Samuel's greeting died in his throat. Grace O'Malley was indeed as lovely as her letters had suggested, chestnut hair pinned beneath a modest bonnet, a slender figure in a traveling dress of deep blue, but his eyes were drawn immediately to the ugly purple bruise that surrounded her right eye, swollen nearly shut. As she stepped fully into view, he noticed how she favored her left side, her breath coming in short, pained gasps. "Miss O'Malley," he managed, stepping forward, her eyes one clear green, one barely visible darted up to his face. "Mr. Cunningham." She attempted to straighten herself, wincing visibly. I apologize for my appearance. There was an incident before I left St. Louis." Samuel's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice gentle. "No apologies needed, madam. Let me help you with your things." As he reached for the single trunk the driver was lowering from the top of the coach, Grace swayed slightly. Samuel abandoned the luggage and moved quickly to steady her, his hand barely touching her elbow. Even that slight contact made her flinch. "Broken ribs, I reckon," she said quietly. "Along with other souvenirs." The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man named Hank who had known Samuel for years, caught his eye over Grace's bonnet. "Found her like this at the station in Flagstaff," he said in a low voice. "Said she fell, but I've seen enough bar fights to know someone used her as a punching bag." Grace's cheeks flushed with shame, and Samuel immediately regretted the public conversation. He signaled Hank to be quiet with a slight shake of his head. "Miss O'Malley, my wagon is just over there," he said, nodding toward a small buckboard tied at the hitching post. "Would you allow me to take you to my home? Or perhaps you'd prefer the hotel until you're feeling better." Grace's chin lifted despite her obvious pain. "I came to be your wife, Mr. Cunningham, not to waste your money on hotel rooms." Her voice was soft but determined. "Unless you wish to reconsider our arrangement given my current state." Samuel studied her face. The mix of fear and pride in her expression tugged at something deep in his chest. "The arrangement stands, Miss O'Malley, if you're still willing, but I think we should visit Doc Wilson before heading to the ranch." He lifted her trunk with one hand and gently offered her his other arm, careful not to press against her injured side. "And Miss O'Malley, whoever did this to you, it won't happen again, not while I'm breathing." That's a promise." Grace's uninjured eye filled with tears that she blinked away quickly. She placed her gloved hand lightly on his forearm. "Thank you, Mr. Cunningham." "Samuel, please," he said, guiding her slowly toward the wagon. "Samuel," she repeated, the ghost of a smile appearing briefly on her lips. "And I am Grace." The town doctor's office was a small whitewashed building 2 streets over from the post office. Samuel helped Grace into the wagon as gently as possible, then placed her trunk in the back. He couldn't help but notice how light it was. All her worldly possessions barely weighed more than a sack of grain. Doc Wilson was just closing up for the day when they arrived, but he ushered them in immediately when he saw Grace's condition. The elderly physician had been treating the residents of Williams since before it was much more than a whistle stop on the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad. His hair was snow white, his hands spotted with age but steady as he guided Grace to an examination table. "I'll wait outside," Samuel said, turning toward the door. "No," Grace said quickly, then looked embarrassed at her outburst. "I mean, if you could stay, Mr. Samuel, just turn your back while the doctor examines me." Samuel nodded and moved to the window, staring out at the street while Doc Wilson murmured questions, and Grace answered in a voice too low to hear. The doctor's occasional hum and "I see" punctuated the silence. After what seemed like an eternity, he heard rustling fabric and the doctor cleared his throat. "You can turn around now, Samuel." Grace was seated on the edge of the examination table, her dress buttoned up to her throat once more, her bonnet resting in her lap. Without it, Samuel could see that her chestnut hair was thick and wavy, pulled back in a simple bun. The bruising around her eye seemed even darker in the late afternoon light that streamed through the office window. "3 broken ribs," Doc Wilson said, his voice matter-of-fact but his eyes kind as they rested on Grace. "Severe bruising along the torso and back. The eye will heal with no lasting damage, fortunately. What Miss O'Malley needs is rest, proper nutrition, and time." "How much time?" Samuel asked. "The ribs will take at least 6 weeks to heal fully. The bruising will fade sooner." The doctor reached for a small brown bottle on his shelf. "Laudanum for the pain, to be taken sparingly, and this salve might help with the bruising." He handed both to Samuel, then turned back to Grace. "Young lady, if I may ask who did this to you?" Grace's eyes dropped to her hands, which were twisting the ribbons of her bonnet. "My former employer," she said quietly. "I worked as a housekeeper for a businessman in St. Louis. When I gave notice that I was leaving to marry Mr. Cunningham, he did not take it well." Samuel's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice even. "Does this man know where you've gone?" Grace shook her head. "I told no one but the mail order service, and they assured me all information is confidential. He was not in his right mind when I left." "I don't believe he will come looking for me." Samuel was not entirely convinced, but he nodded. "Well, you're safe now. Doc Wilson, what do I owe you?" The doctor waved away his offer of payment. "Consider it a wedding present, Samuel. Just bring Miss O'Malley back in a week, so I can check how she's healing." They thanked the doctor and returned to the wagon. The sun was beginning to set, painting the dusty main street of Williams in shades of gold and pink. Grace was silent as Samuel helped her onto the seat, her movements stiff and careful. "It's about 5 miles to my ranch," Samuel said as he guided the horses onto the road heading south out of town. "Not much to look at yet, but the house is solid, and I've got 60 head of cattle now. Should be double that by next spring." Grace nodded, her hands folded primly in her lap, despite the discomfort she must have been feeling from the jolting of the wagon. "Your letters mentioned you've been here 2 years. That's right. Came out from Pennsylvania after the war. Worked as a ranch hand over in Prescott for a few years. Saved every penny," then bought my own place." He glanced at her profile, noting the way she watched the landscape with evident interest. "It gets mighty cold up here in winter. We're at high elevation, but the summers aren't as brutal as down in Phoenix." "It's beautiful," Grace said softly. "All this open space. In St. Louis, the buildings are so close together sometimes I felt like I couldn't breathe." They passed the next few miles in comfortable silence. Samuel wanted to ask more about her past, about the man who had hurt her, but he held his tongue. There would be time for that. For now, getting her settled and rested seemed more important. His ranch came into view as they crested a small rise. The main house was modest but well built, with a covered porch running along the front. A barn and corral stood a short distance away, and beyond that, the pasture island stretched toward the distant mountains. The setting sun cast a warm glow over everything, making the place look almost welcoming. "Here we are," Samuel said, pulling the wagon to a stop in front of the house. "Home." Grace looked at the ranch with an unreadable expression. "It's lovely," she said finally. "Peaceful." "That it is." Samuel jumped down and came around to help her. As he lifted her carefully from the wagon seat, he was acutely aware of how fragile she felt in his arms, how she tried not to wince when his hand accidentally pressed against her injured ribs. "I fixed up the bedroom for you," he said, carrying her trunk up the porch steps. "I'll be sleeping in the barn until you're healed and we've had a proper wedding." Grace's cheeks colored slightly. "That's very gentlemanly of you, Samuel." "Not gentlemanly, just decent." He pushed open the front door and set her trunk down in the small entryway. "Let me show you around." The house was simple but clean. A main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace along one wall. A wooden table with 4 chairs stood in the kitchen area, and a pair of comfortable-looking armchairs faced the fireplace. Through a doorway, Grace could see a bedroom with a new-looking bed frame covered with a colorful quilt. "Mrs. Hollister, she runs the general store with her husband, helped me pick out some things for the house," Samuel explained, looking slightly embarrassed. "Said no wife would want to live with just the basics I'd been making do with." Grace walked slowly around the room, trailing her fingers along the back of one of the armchairs. "It's perfect," she said, and for the first time since she'd arrived, Samuel saw a genuine smile light up her face. Despite the bruising, he caught a glimpse of the beauty that lay beneath. "I never expected anything so nice." Samuel felt warmth spread through his chest at her approval. "There's a pump out back for water and an outhouse about 30 yards behind the house. I've got plans to add a proper washroom someday, but for now, there's a tin tub I bring in for bathing." Grace nodded. "I'm sure I'll manage just fine. Are you hungry? I can fix something simple." "Actually, I'm quite tired from the journey. If you don't mind, I think I'd like to rest." "Of course." Samuel moved toward the bedroom. "I put fresh linens on the bed yesterday. There's a chest of drawers for your things and some hooks on the wall for dresses." Grace followed him into the bedroom. "Thank you, Samuel, for everything. Most men would have turned away when they saw me like this." Samuel turned to face her, his expression serious. "I'm not most men, Grace. I made you a promise in my letters to provide you with a good home and a decent life. I intend to keep it. Even though I'm not what you expected." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You're exactly what I expected, a brave woman willing to travel across the country to start a new life." He hesitated, then added, "The rest is just temporary. You'll heal." Tears welled in Grace's eyes and she looked away quickly. "I'll try not to be a burden while I recover." "You're not a burden." Samuel took a step back, giving her space. "I'll leave you to settle in. There's a pitcher of water on the washstand. I need to see to the animals, but I'll be back to check on you and bring in some supper later." Grace nodded, and Samuel left the room, closing the door softly behind him. As he walked toward the barn, he tried to sort through the tumult of emotions the day had brought. Anger at the man who had hurt her, concern for her recovery, and something else, a protectiveness he hadn't anticipated feeling so strongly. He had expected marriage to be a practical arrangement, a partnership of mutual benefit. He would provide security and a home. She would bring companionship and help with the endless work of running a ranch. But seeing Grace's vulnerability, the courage it must have taken for her to make this journey despite her injuries, had awakened something deeper in him. Samuel wasn't sure what the future would hold for them, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would keep his promise. Grace O'Malley would know no more pain, not from him, not from anyone, as long as he had breath in his body. In the days that followed, Samuel and Grace established a careful routine. Each morning, Samuel would rise before dawn, light the kitchen stove, and put coffee on to boil before heading out to tend the livestock. By the time he returned for breakfast, Grace would be up, moving slowly but insisting on cooking despite his protests. They would share a meal, during which Samuel would outline his plans for the day, and Grace would listen attentively, occasionally offering suggestions that revealed a practical mind. After breakfast, Samuel would return to his ranch work, while Grace rested or attempted small household tasks that wouldn't strain her healing ribs. She tired easily, but Samuel noticed she pushed herself a little further each day, determined not to be idle. On the fourth day after her arrival, Samuel returned to the house for the midday meal to find Grace standing at the kitchen table, kneading bread dough with focused determination. "Should you be doing that?" he asked, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. Grace looked up, a strand of hair falling across her forehead. The swelling around her eye had gone down considerably, though the bruise had turned a yellowish green. "I'm being careful," she said. "Besides, I was going mad just sitting." Samuel smiled slightly. "Stubborn, aren't you?" "My father used to say I got a double portion of Irish stubbornness," she admitted, returning her attention to the dough. "It served me well enough." Samuel washed his hands at the basin, watching her from the corner of his eye. "Your family, they're still in St. Louis?" Grace's movements slowed momentarily. "No, my parents passed 5 years ago, influenza. My brother joined the army afterward and was killed at Fort Laramie 2 years later." "I'm sorry." Samuel leaned against the counter. "No other family. None." She punched down the dough with perhaps more force than necessary. "That's why I took the position as housekeeper. I needed to support myself." Samuel nodded, understanding the unspoken parts of her story. A young woman alone in the world had few options, and that's where you met the man who— "Yes," Grace's voice grew tight. "Mr. Blackwell was a widower, a prominent businessman with connections throughout the city. At first he was perfectly proper, even kind, but over time he began to notice me in ways that made me uncomfortable." Samuel's jaw tightened. "He forced himself on you," he tried. Grace's hands stilled on the dough. "I fought him off the first time. The second time I threatened to go to the authorities. He laughed and said no one would believe a penniless Irish girl over a man of his standing." Her voice grew distant. "He was probably right. So you answered my advertisement." Grace nodded, resuming her kneading. "I saw it in the newspaper and thought it seemed like a chance for something better. When I told Mr. Blackwell I was leaving to be married, he flew into a rage like nothing I'd seen before. Said if he couldn't have me, he'd make sure no other man would want me." She gestured toward her face. "This was the result." Samuel's hands clenched into fists. "How did you get away?" "His housekeeper, an older woman who had shown me kindness, helped me escape while he was at his club that night. She gave me money for a ticket and helped me to the station." Grace shaped the dough into a loaf and placed it in a pan to rise. "I prayed the entire journey that he wouldn't follow me." "If he ever shows his face around here, he'll regret it," Samuel said, his voice low and dangerous. Grace looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "I believe you," she said finally, "but I hope it never comes to that. I'd rather leave the past where it belongs." Samuel nodded, respecting her wish to change the subject. "That bread smells good already." A small smile appeared on Grace's lips. "It was my mother's recipe. I used to help her in the kitchen as a girl." She wiped her hands on her apron. "I've made a pot of bean soup as well. It should be ready." They ate their meal in companionable silence, broken occasionally by Samuel's updates on the ranch work or Grace's questions about Williams and its inhabitants. After lunch, Samuel hesitated at the door. "I need to ride out to check the north pasture fence," he said. "I might not be back until sunset." Grace nodded. "I'll be fine. The bread should be done baking by mid-afternoon, and I thought I might try to sort through my sewing things. I noticed your shirts could use some mending." Samuel looked down at his worn shirt, suddenly self-conscious. "You don't need to do that while you're still healing." "Sewing doesn't strain my ribs," she pointed out, "and I'd like to be useful." Samuel recognized the pride in her voice. "All right, but don't overdo it. Doc Wilson was clear about you needing rest." "I promise to be sensible." Samuel nodded and headed out, feeling a strange reluctance to leave her. As he rode across his property that afternoon, checking fence lines and counting cattle, he found his thoughts returning repeatedly to the woman in his house. Her quiet strength impressed him. Despite everything she had endured, there was no self-pity in her, only determination to move forward. When he returned that evening, the house was filled with the aroma of freshly baked bread. He found Grace seated in one of the armchairs by the fireplace, his blue work shirt in her lap, her needle flashing in the fading light as she stitched a torn seam. She looked up as he entered, and for a moment, the peaceful domesticity of the scene struck him forcefully. This was what he had hoped for when he'd sent away for a bride someone to transform his house into a home. Despite the inauspicious beginning, perhaps they could build something real here after all. "Welcome back," Grace said, setting aside her sewing. "There's stew keeping warm on the stove." "Thank you." Samuel hung up his hat and gun belt. "How are you feeling?" "Better today. I only needed the laudanum once." Samuel nodded approvingly. "Progress." As they settled into their evening routine, Samuel found himself watching Grace covertly, noticing the graceful way she moved despite her injuries, the intelligent light in her eyes when she spoke, the subtle curve of her lips when she smiled. She was nothing like the hard-faced women who worked in the saloons, nor like the prim, sheltered daughters of the town merchants. There was a depth to her, born of hardship but tempered with gentleness. Later that night, after Grace had retired to the bedroom and Samuel had made his bed in the barn's small side room, he lay awake, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. The arrangement felt strange, having a wife who wasn't truly his wife yet. But he respected her need to heal, both physically and emotionally, before they formalized their marriage in the quiet darkness. He made a silent promise to himself and to the woman sleeping in his house. When Grace became his wife in truth, it would be because she wanted it as much as he did, not because of the agreement they had made through letters. He would earn her trust first, then her affection if he could. With that resolution firm in his mind, Samuel drifted off to sleep, unaware that 5 miles away in Williams, a well-dressed stranger was stepping off the late train, asking questions about a young woman with chestnut hair who might have arrived by stagecoach the previous week. 1 week after Grace's arrival, Samuel drove her into town for her appointment with Doc Wilson. The physician pronounced her healing well, though he cautioned that the ribs would remain tender for several more weeks. As they left the doctor's office, Grace tentatively suggested visiting the general store. "I'd like to purchase some fabric," she explained. "I've noticed the curtains in the house are rather worn." Samuel felt a flush of embarrassment. The truth was, he'd never thought much about curtains. The ragged pieces of cloth hanging at his windows were left by the previous owner. "Of course," he agreed. "Whatever you need for the house. It's your home now, too." The proprietor of the general store, Mrs. Hollister, was a plump, friendly woman who greeted Samuel warmly and regarded Grace with undisguised curiosity. News traveled fast in Williams, and Samuel knew the arrival of his mail-order bride, especially one in Grace's condition, had been the subject of much speculation. "So this is your new wife?" Mrs. Hollister exclaimed, extending her hand to Grace. "My, aren't you pretty, even with that nasty bruise? Samuel told us you had an accident before leaving St. Louis." Grace accepted the handshake, her smile polite but reserved. "Thank you, Mrs. Hollister." "Yes, a most unfortunate incident, but I'm healing well." Samuel felt a surge of gratitude toward Grace for maintaining the fiction that her injuries had been accidental, sparing him the need to explain the ugly truth to the town's most notorious gossip. "We're looking for fabric for curtains," he said, steering the conversation away from Grace's condition. "Oh, we just got in some lovely calico prints." Mrs. Hollister led them to a display of fabric bolts. "These would brighten up that dreary house of yours wonderfully." Grace ran her fingers over a bolt of cream-colored cotton with small blue flowers. "This is beautiful," she murmured. "It would match those blue plates I sold Samuel last month," Mrs. Hollister said approvingly. "He's been fixing up that place for weeks, getting ready for you. Bought a proper bed frame, new dishes, even a rocking chair." She winked at Grace. "He might look all rough and ready, but our Samuel's got a soft heart." Samuel cleared his throat, uncomfortable with Mrs. Hollister's revelations. "We'll take 5 yards of the floral print and whatever else Mrs. Cunningham needs." The use of her married name the first time Samuel had referred to her as such brought a flush to Grace's cheeks. "Some thread to match, please, and perhaps a yard of that plain white cotton for dish towels." While Mrs. Hollister measured and cut the fabric, the shop door opened and Sheriff Thomas Burke entered, nodding to Samuel. "Cunningham, madam." He tipped his hat to Grace. "Hope you're settling in well." "Very well, thank you, Sheriff," Grace replied. The sheriff leaned against the counter. "Just thought you should know. There's been a stranger asking questions around town. Well-dressed fellow, Eastern accent. Seems mighty interested in recent arrivals, especially any young women traveling alone." Samuel felt Grace stiffen beside him, her hand freezing on the bolt of fabric she'd been examining. "What kind of questions?" he asked, keeping his voice casual. "Where they might be staying, whether anyone had taken in a young woman recently." The sheriff's eyes drifted to Grace's bruised face, then back to Samuel. "Said he was looking for his ward who'd run away from home. Described a woman with chestnut hair, green eyes." Grace's face had gone pale, her fingers clutching the edge of the counter. Samuel moved closer to her, his body partially shielding her from the door. "You believe this story, Sheriff?" Samuel asked quietly. Burke shrugged. "Not particularly. Man strikes me as the type who's used to getting his way. Offered a substantial reward for information." His gaze shifted briefly to Grace. "I didn't mention anything about anyone matching that description arriving recently. Figured that was none of his business unless he had some legal claim." "Thank you," Grace whispered. The sheriff nodded. "Just thought you ought to know he's in town. Staying at the hotel. Said he plans to move on if his search doesn't pan out in a day or two." After the sheriff left, Samuel quickly paid for their purchases and hurried Grace back to the wagon. She was trembling slightly, her face still unnaturally pale. "It's him," she said as Samuel helped her onto the seat. "Mr. Blackwell, I never thought he would actually come looking for me." Samuel checked that his revolver was secure in its holster before climbing up beside her. "He won't find you," he said firmly. "And if he does, he'll have to go through me to get to you." Grace turned to him, her eyes wide with fear. "You don't understand. He's a powerful man with connections. He could cause trouble for you for your ranch. Let him try." Samuel snapped the reins, urging the horses into a trot. "You're my wife now, Grace. On paper, at least, even if we haven't had a proper ceremony. No one's taking you anywhere you don't want to go." They rode in tense silence back to the ranch. Samuel's mind raced, considering options, planning defenses. The ranch was isolated, which worked both for and against them. It would be difficult for this Blackwell character to find them without help, but if he did, they were far from immediate assistance. As they pulled up to the house, Samuel made a decision. "Pack a bag," he told Grace. "Enough for a few days." She looked at him, puzzled. "Where are we going?" "I have a line camp about 10 miles further into the hills. It's just a simple cabin, but it's well hidden. We'll stay there until your former employer gives up and leaves town." Grace's shoulders slumped with evident relief. "You do that. Put your work on hold to hide away with me." Samuel met her gaze steadily. "I would. I promised you no more pain, remember? That includes fear." Tears welled in Grace's eyes. "I've brought nothing but trouble since I arrived." "No," Samuel said firmly. "You've brought life back to my house. The trouble came looking for you, and we'll face it together." 2 hours later, they were heading into the hills, Samuel on horseback and Grace riding double behind him, her arms wrapped tentatively around his waist. He decided against taking the wagon, which would leave obvious tracks. His cattle could manage without him for a few days. They were well watered and had plenty of grazing land. The line cabin was primitive but sturdy, built into the side of a hill and nearly invisible until you were right upon it. It consisted of one room with a stone fireplace, a narrow cot, a rough table with 2 chairs, and a few basic supplies. Samuel had used it during the winter months when checking on cattle in the high pastures. "It's not much," he apologized as he helped Grace down from the horse. She surveyed the cabin with a small smile. "It's perfect. He'll never find us here." Samuel unsaddled the horse and tethered him in a small clearing behind the cabin where there was good grazing. Inside, he quickly built a fire in the fireplace while Grace unpacked the food they had brought. "I'll take the floor," Samuel said, nodding toward the single cot. "You should be comfortable enough on that." Grace looked at the narrow bed, then back at Samuel. "You're too tall for the floor. We could share just to sleep," she added quickly, a blush coloring her cheeks. "I trust you, Samuel." The simple declaration warmed something inside him. "If you're sure, I promise to be a gentleman." As night fell, the cabin grew chilly despite the fire. They ate a simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried beef, then prepared for sleep. Samuel politely turned his back while Grace changed into her nightgown, donning a shawl over it for extra warmth and modesty. The cot was indeed narrow, but they managed by lying on their sides, Samuel's back to the wall, Grace's back to him, a respectful few inches between them. Despite the strange circumstances, Samuel found himself oddly content. The sound of Grace's breathing, gradually slowing as she drifted toward sleep, was comforting in the darkness of the cabin. "Samuel," her voice was soft in the darkness. "Yes, thank you for protecting me." Samuel hesitated, then gently placed his arm over her, careful to avoid her injured ribs. "Always," he promised. They remained at the line cabin for 3 days, establishing a peaceful routine. During the daylight hours, Samuel would check the perimeter, ensuring no one had found their hiding place, while Grace turned the sparse cabin into something resembling a home. She discovered wild onions and herbs growing nearby, which she added to their provisions to create surprisingly tasty meals over the open fire. In the evenings, they would sit by the fireplace, talking long into the night. Samuel told her about his childhood in Pennsylvania, his service during the Civil War, and his journey west afterward, seeking a fresh start. Grace shared stories of her parents and brother, their life in Ireland before emigrating to America, and her dreams of someday having a family of her own. "Do you think you could be happy here?" Samuel asked on the third night, watching the firelight play across her features. Her bruises were fading, revealing more of her natural beauty each day. "Not just in this cabin, I mean, but at the ranch in Arizona." Grace met his gaze, her expression thoughtful. "I think I could," she said slowly. "It's so different from city life, but there's something honest about it. The land demands hard work but gives back in equal measure." She smiled. "And the company isn't half bad." Samuel chuckled. "High praise indeed." "I meant it," she said, her tone growing serious. "You're a good man, Samuel Cunningham, better than I dared hope for when I answered your advertisement, even though our start has been complicated by your former employer." "Perhaps because of it," she admitted. "You could have sent me away when you saw my condition, or when you learned Blackwell was looking for me. Instead, you've shown me nothing but kindness and respect." She hesitated, then added softly, "I'm beginning to think I might have found more than just safety with you." Samuel's heart quickened at her words, at the shy warmth in her eyes. They had been sharing the narrow cot each night, maintaining a respectful distance, but the intimacy of their conversations had bridged the physical gap between them more effectively than touch ever could. "I feel the same," he admitted. "When I sent for a bride, I was looking for a practical arrangement, but now—" He reached across the space between their chairs, taking her hand gently in his. "Now I find myself hoping for more than that." Grace's fingers curled around his, her touch sending warmth up his arm and into his chest. "I'd like that too." The moment stretched between them, full of promise and possibility. Then Samuel reluctantly released her hand and stood. "We should get some rest. Tomorrow I'll ride into town, see if Blackwell is still around. If he's gone, we can head back to the ranch." Grace nodded, though Samuel thought he detected a hint of disappointment in her eyes at the broken moment. As they prepared for sleep that night, the respectful distance between them on the narrow cot seemed to have shrunk, Grace's back fitting against Samuel's chest, as naturally as if they'd been sleeping this way for years. The following morning, Samuel rode into Williams alone, leaving Grace safely hidden at the cabin. He approached the town cautiously, keeping his hat pulled low, and tethered his horse behind the sheriff's office rather than on the main street. Sheriff Burke was at his desk when Samuel entered, sorting through wanted posters. He looked up, unsurprised. "Figured you'd show up eventually. Your wife with you. She's safe," Samuel said, not elaborating. "Is he still here?" "Left yesterday afternoon on the eastbound train," Burke confirmed. "Seemed mighty frustrated. Kept insisting his ward must have passed through here." The sheriff leaned back in his chair. "I might have mentioned that the stagecoach manifest showed no single women traveling alone in the past month, and that you'd been married for nearly a year, brought your wife out from Pennsylvania last summer." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "That's so." "Official records can be mighty confusing sometimes," Burke said with a shrug. "Especially when a man waves his money around, thinking he can buy information." His expression grew serious. "Whatever the truth is, Cunningham, I decided I didn't much like the look of that fellow. Something off about him, too smooth if you take my meaning." "I appreciate your discretion, Sheriff," Burke nodded. "Just do right by the lady. She seems like she's had enough trouble. That's my intention." Samuel turned to leave, then paused, if he comes back." "I'll send word," the sheriff promised. Samuel stopped by the general store on his way out of town, purchasing a few items, including a small package he tucked carefully inside his shirt. By mid-afternoon, he was back at the line cabin, where Grace waited anxiously. "He's gone," Samuel announced as he dismounted. "Sheriff Burke convinced him you weren't here, never had been." The relief on Grace's face was palpable. She sagged against the cabin doorframe, one hand pressed to her heart. "Thank God." "We can head back to the ranch tomorrow morning," Samuel said, leading his horse to water. "Unless you'd like to stay here another night." Grace looked around at the tiny cabin. "Oddly enough, I think I might miss this place. We've been comfortable here." Samuel understood what she meant. Away from the ranch, from the expectations of their arranged marriage, they had found an unexpected ease with each other. "We can come back sometime," he suggested. "When you're fully healed, maybe for a picnic." Grace smiled. "I'd like that." That evening, their last at the cabin, Samuel pulled the small package from his shirt after dinner. "I got you something in town," he said, suddenly feeling awkward as he handed it to her. Grace unwrapped the paper carefully to reveal a simple silver band. She looked up at Samuel, her eyes wide. "It's not fancy," he said quickly. "But I thought, well, we never had a proper wedding. If you still want to go through with this with us, maybe we could have a real ceremony in town, with a preacher and everything." Grace picked up the ring, turning it in the firelight. "Are you proposing to me, Samuel Cunningham?" she asked, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I suppose I am." He moved to kneel in front of her chair, taking her hand in his. "Grace O'Malley, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? For real this time, not just on paper." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but the smile that blossomed on her face was radiant. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." Samuel slipped the ring onto her finger, then leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she didn't, he pressed his lips gently to hers in their first kiss. It was soft and sweet, a promise rather than a demand, and when he pulled back, the look in Grace's eyes told him everything he needed to know. Whatever had begun as a practical arrangement had transformed into something far more precious. The next morning, they packed up their few belongings and prepared to leave the cabin. Before mounting the horse, Samuel took Grace's hands in his. "When we get back to the ranch, I'll continue sleeping in the barn until we're properly married," he assured her. "I want to do this right." Grace squeezed his hands. "I know you do. It's one of the reasons I'm falling in love with you." The simple declaration left Samuel momentarily speechless. When he found his voice, it was rough with emotion. "I'm falling in love with you too, Grace. Have been since you stepped down from that stagecoach, bruises and all." Their return to the ranch marked the beginning of a new chapter. True to his word, Samuel continued to sleep in the barn while Grace occupied the house, but they spent their days together, working side by side to prepare for both the upcoming winter and their wedding. Grace's strength returned a little more each day. By the end of her third week at the ranch, she was helping with the chickens Samuel had purchased in town, gathering eggs and feeding the noisy flock each morning. She planted a small kitchen garden behind the house, explaining that next spring she would expand it considerably. Her cooking filled the house with mouth-watering aromas, and the new curtains she sewed brightened the windows. For his part, Samuel found himself working with renewed purpose. The ranch, which had been merely a means to an end before a way to build wealth and security, now represented the future he hoped to create with Grace. He repaired fences, expanded the chicken coop, and began planning a proper washroom addition to the house. 3 weeks after their return from the line cabin, they rode into town one Sunday morning. Grace wore her best dress, a deep green that brought out the color of her eyes, and Samuel had on his Sunday suit, freshly brushed, and with a new shirt Grace had sewn for him. They headed straight for the small white church at the edge of town. The congregation's curious stares were impossible to miss as Samuel and Grace entered, but the preacher welcomed them warmly. After the service, Samuel approached him privately, and arrangements were made for a wedding ceremony the following Saturday. News spread quickly through Williams. By Monday morning, it seemed everyone knew that Samuel Cunningham and his mail-order bride were to be properly married that weekend. Visitors began arriving at the ranch, women from town bringing pies and casseroles, offering help with preparations, men stopping by with bottles of whiskey and hearty congratulations. Mrs. Hollister appeared on Wednesday with several yards of fine white cotton. "For a wedding dress," she announced. "Every bride should have something special, even if it's simple." Grace was overwhelmed by the kindness of these virtual strangers. "I don't know what to say," she told Samuel that evening as they sat on the porch after supper. "They're just happy to see someone getting married," he said with a smile. "Not much excitement around here most days." "It's more than that," Grace insisted. "They've accepted me, even knowing I came as a mail-order bride, even with—" She gestured toward her face, where the last faint yellowing of the bruise was barely visible now. "They've been kinder than I expected." Samuel reached over to take her hand. "That's Williams for you. Folks look out for each other here." He paused. "Are you nervous about Saturday?" Grace thought for a moment. "Not about marrying you," she said honestly, "but about after. It's been a long time since a man touched me with anything but cruelty." Samuel brought her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "We'll take things as slow as you need, Grace. There's no rush. We have the rest of our lives." The day of the wedding dawned clear and cool, a perfect early autumn day in the high country. Grace stood before the small mirror in the bedroom, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. Mrs. Hollister and several other women from town had helped her prepare, styling her hair in an elegant arrangement with small white flowers tucked into the chestnut waves. The dress they had sewn was simple but beautiful, fitted at the waist and flowing gracefully to the floor. Most remarkably, her face showed no traces of the bruises that had marked her arrival in Williams. When she studied her reflection, she saw only clear skin, bright eyes, and a healthy glow that came from weeks of fresh air, good food, and she had to admit happiness. A knock at the bedroom door pulled her from her thoughts. "Grace," Mrs. Hollister called, "the wagon's here to take us to town. Are you ready, dear?" Grace took a deep breath. "Yes," she said, and realized she meant it in every possible way. "I'm ready." Samuel was waiting at the front of the church when Grace entered on the arm of Sheriff Burke, who had volunteered to give her away. The look on Samuel's face as he saw her for the first time in her wedding dress was something Grace knew she would remember forever, a mixture of awe, tenderness, and unmistakable love that made her heart swell in her chest. The ceremony was brief, but meaningful. They exchanged simple vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other for the rest of their days. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed her with a gentle passion that sent warmth spreading through her entire body. The celebration afterward at the town hall was lively, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed half the territory. Grace found herself welcomed unreservedly into the community, dancing with the sheriff, the doctor, and several ranchers before Samuel reclaimed her for the final dance of the evening. "Happy, Mrs. Cunningham?" he asked as he guided her around the floor. "More than I ever thought possible," she admitted, smiling up at him. "And you, Mr. Cunningham? I'd say I'm the luckiest man in the Arizona Territory." He pulled her a little closer, his voice dropping to a whisper, "And I can't wait to take you home." The ride back to the ranch was filled with a nervous anticipation that neither of them acknowledged directly. Samuel helped Grace down from the wagon, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms to carry her across the threshold of their home. "Welcome home, wife," he said, setting her gently on her feet in the main room. Grace looked around at the house that had become so familiar over the past weeks, seeing it with new eyes now that she was truly mistress of it. "It feels different somehow," she said. "Good different, very good." She turned to face him, suddenly shy despite the weeks they had spent getting to know each other. "Samuel, He stepped closer, cupping her face gently in his hands. "We don't have to rush anything, Grace. I meant what I said before." She placed her hands on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "I know, and that's why I'm sure." She rose on tiptoes, pressing her lips to his. "I want to be your wife in every way." Samuel's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as he returned her kiss with increasing fervor. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Grace Cunningham," he murmured. "More than I thought possible when I sent that letter east looking for a bride." "And I love you, Samuel Cunningham," she replied, her voice steady and sure. "More than I dreamed I could love anyone." He took her hand then and led her toward the bedroom, their bedroom now, truly and completely. And as the door closed behind them, Grace knew that Samuel's promise had been kept. The pain of her past was finally behind her, replaced by a love that healed more completely than time ever could. Winter came early to the high country that year, the first snow falling just 2 weeks after the wedding. Grace stood at the window of the ranch house, watching the white flakes swirl against the darkening sky, a sense of contentment filling her that she had never known before. Behind her, Samuel added another log to the fire, then came to stand with his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on top of her head. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he murmured. She agreed, leaning back against his solid warmth. "Though I hope it's not too hard on the cattle." Samuel chuckled. "Listen to you, already thinking like a rancher's wife. Is that a bad thing? Not at all." He turned her in his arms to face him. "It's one of the many things I love about you. You've taken to this life like you were born to it." It was true. The past 2 months had seen Grace transform from a city woman to a capable ranch wife. She had learned to ride, helped with the fall cattle roundup, and put up preserves for the winter. The house had become truly hers, filled with touches that reflected her personality, a quilt she was piecing together in the evenings, dried flowers arranged in pottery vases, the smell of fresh bread and pies that seemed to permanently infuse the air. More importantly, she and Samuel had settled into a partnership that went beyond their initial practical arrangement. They worked together during the days, sharing the endless tasks that ranch life demanded. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes reading, sometimes talking, sometimes simply enjoying the comfortable silence between them. And at night, in the privacy of their bedroom, they had discovered a passion that surprised them both, Samuel with his gentle reverence for her body, Grace with her eager response to his touch. "I was thinking," Samuel said, leading her to the chairs by the fire, "that we might take a trip to Prescott in the spring. There's a horse auction I usually attend, and I thought you might enjoy seeing the town. It's bigger than Williams, has some nice shops." Grace smiled, touched by his thoughtfulness. "I'd like that, though I'm not sure I'll want to leave the garden once I get it planted." "Ah, yes, the garden." Samuel's eyes twinkled. "Mrs. Hollister told me you've ordered enough seeds to feed half the county." "We'll need it," Grace said, a slight blush coloring her cheeks, "if my suspicions are correct." Samuel's brow furrowed in confusion, then cleared suddenly as understanding dawned. "Grace, are you saying?" She nodded, her hand moving unconsciously to rest on her still flat stomach. "I'm not entirely certain yet, but I'm about 6 weeks late, and I've been feeling a bit queasy in the mornings." Samuel stared at her for a long moment, then let out a whoop of joy that startled her. He pulled her from her chair into his lap, cradling her against his chest with a gentleness that belied his excitement. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby." Grace laughed at his enthusiasm, her own eyes bright with happiness. "If I'm right, sometime in late spring or early summer." "Boy or girl doesn't matter," Samuel declared, "though I hope the child has your eyes and your spirit. And your kindness," Grace added, touching his cheek tenderly. "Your strength." They sat together by the fire as the snow continued to fall outside, making plans for the future, plans that now included a nursery, a rocking cradle that Samuel promised to build, tiny clothes that Grace would sew during the long winter evenings. As the months passed, Grace's suspicions were confirmed. Her body changed, growing rounded with new life, and Samuel watched the transformation with undisguised wonder. He became even more protective of her, insisting she rest frequently, taking on extra chores to spare her any strain. Grace tolerated his hovering with good humor, knowing it came from love, though she continued to do her share of the lighter work around the ranch. Spring arrived in a burst of wildflowers and new green growth across the range eland. Grace's garden flourished under her care, and the cattle herd increased with the arrival of new calves. Samuel hired 2 young men from town to help with the ranch work, anticipating that he would want more time at the house once the baby arrived. In early June, just as the summer heat was beginning to build, Grace went into labor. Samuel sent one of the hired hands galloping toward town to fetch Doc Wilson, then paced anxiously outside the bedroom as Mrs. Hollister and 2 other women from Williams helped Grace through her travail. After what seemed like an eternity, the cry of a newborn pierced the evening air, followed shortly by Mrs. Hollister's beaming face at the bedroom door. "You have a son, Mr. Cunningham," she announced. "A fine, strong boy with a good set of lungs on him." Samuel sagged against the wall in relief, then straightened. "And Grace, tired but well. You can come in now." He entered the bedroom to find Grace propped up against the pillows, her face flushed and damp with perspiration, but wearing a smile that outshone the sun. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. "Come meet your son," she said softly as Samuel approached the bed. He sat carefully beside her, staring in awe at the tiny red face peering out from the blanket. A shock of dark hair, his color, not Grace's lighter brown, covered the baby's head, and when the infant opened his eyes, Samuel saw they were the same clear green as his mother's. "He's perfect," Samuel whispered, gently touching his son's cheek with one finger. "We need to name him," Grace said. "I was thinking perhaps Patrick, after my father, Patrick Cunningham." Samuel tested the name, nodding in approval. "A good, strong name." He leaned forward to kiss Grace's forehead. "Thank you for this gift, my love." "Thank you for keeping your promise," she replied, her eyes shining with happiness. "No more pain, only joy." As the women busied themselves cleaning up and Doc Wilson packed his bag to leave, Samuel and Grace remained together on the bed, marveling at the new life they had created. The journey that had begun with a mail-order bride stepping off a stagecoach, battered and fearful, had led them here to a family bound by love, strength, and unwavering commitment. In the years that followed, the Cunningham ranch prospered. Samuel's cattle operation expanded, and Grace's garden became famous throughout the county for its abundance. Patrick grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's determination and his mother's gentle heart. He was joined 2 years later by a sister, Margaret, named for Samuel's mother, and 3 years after that by another boy, Joseph. The shadows of Grace's past faded completely, replaced by the brightness of her present. Occasionally, they would still ride up to the line cabin for a day or a night away from the bustle of ranch life, remembering the days when they had first begun to fall in love. And each time, Samuel would renew his promise to her, the one he had made that first day in Williams, when a battered young woman had stepped off the stagecoach and into his heart. No more pain. Only love, only joy, only the life they had built together, stronger than the harsh wilderness around them, more enduring than the mountains that rose in the distance, more precious than all the gold that had lured men west in search of fortune. Samuel had found his fortune the day Grace arrived. And Grace had found the home she had always longed for, not just a place, but a person who made her feel safe, cherished, and loved beyond measure. As they celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children, friends from town, and the ranch hands who had become like family, Samuel pulled Grace aside for a private moment on the porch. The setting sun painted the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of the roses Grace had planted along the front walkway. "Regrets?" he asked, his arm around her waist as they looked out over the ranch that had flourished under their care. Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand finding his. "Not a single one," she answered truthfully. "Every step of the journey led me here to you, to this life we've built. How could I regret any of it?" Samuel turned to her, the love in his eyes as strong as it had been on their wedding day. "I thank God every day for bringing you to me, bruises and all. And I thank God for a man who saw beyond those bruises to the woman beneath," Grace replied, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. "A man who kept his promise, no more pain, only love." As the sun dipped below the horizon, they rejoined their guests, hand in hand. Hearts intertwined, the mail-order bride and the cowboy who had found in each other not just a practical arrangement, but a love story written across the wild landscape of Arizona, a story that would continue for all the days of their lives.